I always knew where I stood in my father's family, somewhere between the houseplants and the help. Present, but not acknowledged. Existing, but never quite allowed to belong. My mother used to tell me not to let it bother me, but it's hard to ignore when you're consistently treated like nothing in the family, that never missed a chance to remind you where you came from. To them, I was the product of an affair, a living, breathing reminder that their golden boy, my father, had stepped out of his perfect marriage. His wife, whom everyone adored and practically treated like a queen, had already given him a son, Alex. That made her the real wife and Alex the legitimate child. Me? I was just the side project. Every Christmas I watched Alex unwrap box after box of gifts from our uncles, aunts, and even family friends. I usually got a polite card, sometimes with a gift card inside if someone remembered. The adults would pat Alex on the back and say how proud they were of the future CEO, the rightful heir, the spitting image of his father. I was mostly invisible unless someone needed a hand in the kitchen or someone to take the group photos. Once, I was about 8 when Alex had a birthday party at our father's estate. A huge one, catered with a magician and a bouncy castle and personalized cupcakes. I was there too, sitting off to the side near the kitchen with the staff. My dad told me it was complicated to explain to everyone why I was there, so it was best if I kept a low profile. I remember he gave me a small silver bracelet and said he'd try to make it up to me next time. He never did. It wasn't that my dad didn't care. At least, I don't think so. He used to visit us, me and my mom, in the city every few weeks. He paid for my school, bought groceries for our apartment, and made sure we had what we needed. But it always felt like a secret arrangement. He wouldn't walk in holding my hand. He'd never post a photo of us or talk about me at family gatherings. I wasn't even allowed to call him Dad when we were outside. He said it was just to avoid drama, that he wanted to protect me from unnecessary judgment. But when you're a kid, it doesn't feel like protection. It feels like rejection. My mother bore the brunt of it, and she was constantly judged and whispered about and blamed for ruining a marriage she never intended to destroy. She told me she didn't want to fight for a spot in a place that never wanted us. I asked her once why she never married anyone else, why she stayed tied to a man who could barely acknowledge us when it mattered. She just said that some mistakes come with consequences you have to carry, and I was never one of them. Still, I tried to fit in. I'd show up to birthdays and holidays when invited, dressed nicely, carrying a neutral smile, always careful not to step out of line. And one year, I even bought Alex a birthday present with my savings, a leather notebook I thought he'd like. He barely looked at it before tossing it aside. His mother saw me hand it to him and muttered something under her breath, loud enough for me to hear. Something about me trying too hard for a family that didn't belong to me. By the time I turned 16, I had stopped going to the estate, and I told my dad I had school or part-time work. The truth was, I just couldn't stomach the pitying looks or the side-eye glances anymore. My dad would still come to see me sometimes, taking me out to lunch or helping with college forms, but even that started to taper off as I got older. I think he knew the distance was growing, but he didn't know how to stop it. When I got into college, it was a small scholarship and a loan. My father offered to cover the rest, and I let him. I guess part of me still wanted him to feel like a dad. But when I graduated, there was no celebration from his side of the family. No family dinner, no proud father speech, just a congratulatory card signed from all of us, with no names inside. I didn't even know if they knew who they were congratulating. Meanwhile, Alex was flourishing, or at least that's what everyone thought. He had dropped out of college, but was still working with my father in his company, learning from the inside. They called him the heir to the throne. My name, of course, was never attached to anything. I kept moving forward. I got a job in another city and started saving and called my dad on birthdays. I kept it cordial but distant. I had accepted by then that I would never be part of that world. Not really. And that was until I got the phone call. It was early morning and I was getting ready for work when an unknown number appeared on my screen. I ignored it at first, but they left a voicemail. It was my father's lawyer. He said I needed to come in urgently. My father had passed away the night before. I sat on the edge of my bed, phone still in my hand, and felt nothing, just empty. Not sadness, not relief, just a hollow pause in my chest. The lawyer insisted it was important. He said there were things my father had arranged that concerned me directly. I assumed it was something small, maybe a letter, maybe a piece of jewelry. I hadn't expected much, certainly not anything significant. After all, I was just the invisible daughter, the one he politely ignored, the one they never saw coming. But that meeting, it would change everything I thought I knew about where I stood in my father's life and his family's. Update 1. I showed up at the lawyer's office 2 days after the call, still unsure why I was even summoned. The weather was miserable, grey skies, steady drizzle that matched my mood. I hadn't gone to the funeral. I wasn't invited. No one called. No one thought to ask if I was coming, and I didn't ask either. I just assumed I wasn't welcome, like always. Also, I didn't know where it was being held. The office was uptown, tucked inside one of those older brick buildings with dark wood interiors and bookshelves stacked with dusty legal volumes no one ever touched anymore. The lawyer? Mr. Bernstein? Looked like he'd been doing this since the 1980s. All grey hair and serious expressions. He offered condolences, but I could tell he wasn't the emotional type. He shuffled through a stack of papers and told me we'd begin once the other parties arrived. Other parties. Right. Not even 15 minutes later, in walked the rest of them. My father's widow, Elaine, flawless makeup, a black designer coat, and a face so stiff with Botox she could barely frown. Beside her was Alex, sunglasses on indoors like he was protecting his celebrity status, followed by 2 uncles and a cousin or 2. They looked at me like I'd wandered into the wrong room. Elaine immediately asked what I was doing there. Mr. Bernstein calmly said I had been named in the will and had every right to be present. Her eyebrows twitched. Alex just smirked and leaned back like this was going to be entertaining. Mr. Bernstein didn't waste time. He read the usual formalities about debts and charitable donations. Then came the part that flipped the room upside down. To my daughter, the only child who ever saw me as a man instead of a paycheck, I leave the entirety of my estate. This includes my shares in the company, my home, my private accounts, and all remaining personal assets. The silence was so loud, I could hear the second hand on the wall clock ticking. Elaine was the first to break it. She said that must have been a mistake. She demanded to know if there had been a second will, a newer one that made sense. Mr. Bernstein calmly said this was the most recent, legally binding version, signed and notarized only 2 months prior. He even held it up for them to see. Alex stood up like he was ready to fight someone. He asked what kind of a joke this was. He said I wasn't even really family. He said I was a mistake, that I didn't deserve any of it. My hands stayed folded in my lap, but my nails were digging into my palms. I didn't flinch. Then Elaine asked the big question. Why? Why would my father, who practically raised Alex as his golden child, do this? Mr. Bernstein looked at me and then reached for a sealed envelope from the file. He said my father had written a personal letter to be read aloud in the event of his death. I hadn't known about that. My stomach turned. The letter was short, handwritten. It started with a few lines about regret, about how he had made choices in his life to protect his image, to preserve a false sense of family, to avoid conflict. He wrote that while he loved all of us, only one of them had ever seen him fully and accepted him anyway. He talked about me, how I never asked him for anything more than time, how I had forgiven him again and again even when he'd failed me, how I showed him what loyalty looked like, not through words, but through quiet understanding. He admitted he had failed me, that he had allowed his family to treat me like a shadow, that he never stood up for me the way he should have, and that it ate away at him year after year. Then came the most shocking part. He wrote that Alex had stolen from him substantial amounts of money, that Elaine had known and helped cover it up to avoid embarrassment, that this wasn't a rumor, it was backed by evidence, which he had given to Mr. Bernstein to share with the board of his company if anyone contested the will. You could hear a pin drop after that. Alex's face was red with rage. Elaine looked like she had been punched. She kept insisting that my father must have been manipulated or unwell when he wrote that, but Mr. Bernstein calmly stated that my father had taken every legal and medical precaution to confirm he was of sound mind when finalizing the will. I didn't say a word. I couldn't. My body was frozen. I had come expecting a simple formality, maybe a gesture of closure. I never expected to be handed everything they thought would be theirs. I never expected the man who always kept me in the shadows to finally pull me into the light. When the meeting was over, Elaine stormed out first. Alex followed, still shouting about how this wasn't over and how I'd regret it. I didn't respond. My mind was still stuck on the phrase from the letter, the only child who ever saw me as a man. I stayed a little longer to ask Mr. Bernstein what this meant for the company, for the estate, for the fallout I was now about to walk into. He said it meant a lot of paperwork, a lot of decisions, and possibly a lot of unwanted attention. But he said I had every legal right to everything that had been given to me. I walked out of that office, not with triumph, but with a quiet, stunned heaviness. For so long, I had been ignored, dismissed, and shoved aside. And now, suddenly, I held the keys to a kingdom I was never meant to enter. But this wasn't about revenge, at least not for me. Update 2. News travels fast when there's money involved. By the next morning, I'd already received a series of emails from the company board requesting a meeting with me as the new primary shareholder. Apparently, my father hadn't just handed me a bank account and a few properties. He had left me controlling interest in the very company my half-brother used to brag he'd take over one day. I didn't even know how to feel. I hadn't planned for any of this. I worked a regular office job, paid my rent on time, and lived a quiet life. But now, just like that, I was sitting on top of assets and responsibilities worth millions. And then came the texts. One from my cousin, a half-hearted attempt to check in and see how I was holding up. Another from an aunt who hadn't spoken to me in years, who said we should Catch up soon. I deleted them without replying. But the one that stopped me in my tracks was from Alex. He said we needed to talk, that there had to be a misunderstanding, that Dad must have written the will in a moment of confusion, and that I knew deep down it was meant for him. He even had the nerve to ask if I could at least share the inheritance, since he had always been like a brother to me. I didn't respond. What was there to say? Instead, I called Mr. Bernstein and asked for help arranging security for my father's estate. I had a bad feeling that something was coming, and I was right. That weekend, I went back to my father's house for the first time in years. It still didn't feel like mine. Everything was pristine and cold, just like Elaine had always kept it. No family photos of me, just elegant decorations, spotless surfaces, and portraits of Alex from every stage of his life. I wasn't there to redecorate or make changes. I just needed time to process. But I wasn't alone for long. Elaine showed up, unannounced. She let herself in using her old key, something I made a note to change immediately, and walked through the front door like she still owned the place. She didn't even look at me. She just said she was there to collect a few personal things. I reminded her that everything in the house now legally belonged to me, and that she needed to make a list and go through proper channels. She laughed, like I was being dramatic, and then she said something that made my skin crawl. She said, "You don't belong here. You're nothing but a walking reminder of your mother's shame." I had heard variations of that sentiment my whole life, but this time was different. This time, she was standing in the foyer, talking down to me like she still had the upper hand. I told her the visit was over and that she needed to leave. She tried to argue, said she'd call the police if I laid a finger on her. I told her to go ahead. I'd love for the authorities to show up and hear about how she tried to steal from a house she no longer had any claim to. That shut her up. She grabbed her bag and stormed out, heels clicking like gunshots on the marble floor. That night, I walked through the house, alone, room by room, trying to make sense of it all. I found an old box tucked behind some files in my father's study. Inside were photographs of me and him from when I was younger, photos I'd never seen before, me sitting on his shoulders at the zoo, us laughing over ice cream, a few birthday cards I had written him, the handwriting painfully childish. There was a small note inside too. His handwriting, scratchy, uneven. "I wish I'd done better by you. I was proud of you, even when I didn't say it. This world doesn't treat girls like you fairly, but I hope this helps change that. I hope you build something with it, something that's yours." I sat on the floor numb. I wanted to cry. For all the years he didn't show up. For all the times he let others speak for him. For all the birthdays he missed. But also for this small, quiet truth that somewhere deep down he had seen me. Maybe not enough, maybe too late, but still he saw me. The next morning I woke up to chaos. Apparently word of the will had leaked, and a few nosy relatives had gone with claims that I manipulated my father in his final days. Some even suggested I had tricked him into changing his will. I was suddenly a trending topic in some niche online forums. And through it all, Alex was silent. No public statement, no social media outburst, nothing. Which only made me more suspicious. Mr. Bernstein called later that afternoon with an update. He told me the board had accepted my place as the majority shareholder, but warned that Alex had privately been trying to stir dissent. Apparently, he had tried to convince some old allies that my father had made the change to punish him and that I would sell off everything out of spite. I asked Mr. Bernstein what my options were, and he said I had two: lay low and let the noise pass, or take control publicly, firmly, and without hesitation. I knew what I had to do. That week, I scheduled a meeting with the company board, not to ask for permission, but to announce that I was stepping into my role. I wasn't going to run the day-to-day operations. I had no experience in corporate leadership, but I was going to hire the right people, keep things ethical, and ensure that every shady corner of my father's company was finally brought into the light. I also issued a formal press release, short, calm, direct. I stated that I had received the inheritance legally and without contests from my father's legal team, that I had no intention of selling off the company or the estate. I was committed to honoring the legacy of the man who, in the end, had chosen to do the right thing. And then I had asked them to add one final line. Let the past speak for itself. I'm here to build the future. It was the start of something bigger than me. Update 3. For a few weeks, things were eerily quiet, too quiet. I had assumed Alex was lying low after his failed attempt to turn the board against me, but I should have known better. Alex didn't know how to lose. He'd always been the golden boy, praised for breathing, rewarded for mediocrity, and protected from every consequence. So it made perfect sense that his silence wasn't surrender. It was preparation. It started when I got a notice in the mail, a legal challenge to the will. I almost laughed when I read the first few lines. He was claiming my father had been mentally incompetent when he rewrote the will, that he had been under emotional duress and coerced by me in his vulnerable state. He went as far as saying I used manipulative tactics stemming from a strained, resentful relationship. He painted himself as the devoted son, the one who had cared for our father, the one who had managed the estate, the company, the family, while I was nothing but a bitter, estranged daughter looking for a payday. It was ridiculous, but ridiculous things have a way of gaining traction when enough money and bitterness are involved. I immediately called Mr. Bernstein, who told me not to panic. Apparently, Alex had retained a flashy but deeply unserious lawyer who loved tabloid drama. Bernstein assured me that unless they could provide actual proof of manipulation or fraud, the will would stand. Dad's mental competency had been certified not once, but twice before the will was finalized. All the documents were airtight. Still, it made my stomach twist. I hadn't done anything wrong, but Alex had always been the kind of person who could cause a firestorm just by whining loud enough. And this time, he wasn't just whining, he was strategizing. And through it all, I stayed quiet. It wasn't because I didn't want to fight back. It was because Mr. Bernstein told me something I'll never forget. He said, "Let them shout into the wind. When people are desperate, they make noise. But noise doesn't win court cases. Proof does. And you have it. All of it." So I waited. I focused on stabilizing the company. I hired a respected executive to help manage operations. I started reviewing old records and board meeting transcripts. And somewhere in the middle of all of that, I found something that made me freeze. A financial report from 3 years ago, buried under vague summaries and clever accounting, showing that Alex had authorized massive payouts from company funds into personal ventures that went belly up. One of them was a luxury condo development that never got approved. Another was a so-called tech startup that folded within months. But all of them had one thing in common. The money was gone, unaccounted for. I handed the report to Mr. Bernstein, who reviewed it and nodded slowly. He said, "This wasn't just bad business. If it had been hidden from the board, and it had, this could qualify as corporate fraud." Suddenly, the lawsuit made sense. Alex hadn't just wanted revenge or the family legacy, he wanted protection. He knew that the deeper I dug, the closer I'd get to find out how deep his mismanagement ran. Challenging the will wasn't about me. It was about distracting everyone from him. Our father had let it go, but I wouldn't. I had two choices. I could go nuclear and expose him publicly, or I could wait for court and let his lies unravel in front of a judge. I chose the second. The court date was set. I didn't tell anyone what I had found. Nobody knew the full extent of what I planned to reveal. I wanted Alex to feel safe, arrogant, prepared, and he did. He walked into that courtroom with a smirk, surrounded by handlers. He wore a charcoal grey suit and an expression that screamed entitlement. His lawyer opened with a dramatic statement about betrayal and family dishonor. They made me sound like a villain straight out of a soap opera. And then it was our turn. Mr. Bernstein was calm and razor sharp. He laid out the timeline, the mental competency reports, and the clean documentation of every step my father had taken. And then, just before closing, he introduced the financial report. The room got quiet. Alex's lawyer looked confused. Alex started fidgeting in his seat. Bernstein explained the payouts, the cover-ups, the lack of board approval, and then he dropped the final piece, a letter from my father to the board chair dated 8 months before he died. In the letter, my father acknowledged discovering Alex's actions and expressed regret over ignoring certain warning signs. He wrote that he was preparing to restructure everything because some inheritances are no longer deserved. You could have heard a pin drop. The judge called for a recess. Alex stormed out, ignoring the small forum reporters he had called. Elaine was nowhere to be found. That night, everything flipped. I wasn't the villain anymore. I was the quiet daughter who'd stayed out of the spotlight, only to be handed the burden of cleaning up someone else's mess. But the real shock came the next morning. Mr. Bernstein called me early. He said Alex had withdrawn the lawsuit. Not only that, he had fled the country. No press statement, no apology, just silence. Elaine sold her townhouse 2 days later, and just like that, the people who used to treat me like a footnote were disappearing one by one, scrambling, retreating, trying to pretend they hadn't spent years writing me off. But they had. And soon they would find out exactly why my father left everything to me, and what secret he had kept all these years that finally tipped the scale. Update 4. The dust hadn't even settled after Alex fled the country, but the aftermath kept rippling. Old board members began distancing themselves from him. Former employees came forward quietly, telling me stories about how Alex had bullied his way into control, ignored Dad's actual plans for the future. One of them, a retired executive named Harold, requested a private meeting. What he said that day still gave me chills. He told me there was something I needed to see, something my father had once trusted him to keep under wraps, just in case things ever got ugly. At the time, Harold hadn't understood what my dad meant, but after what had happened in court, he finally did. He handed me a USB drive and said it was from my father, a recording. I played it that night, alone in my study. My father's voice came through, clear as day, calm and steady. He was sitting in his office, maybe a year before he passed, judging by his tone. He said he knew that when he died, chaos would likely follow, and he wanted someone, anyone, to understand why he'd made the decisions he did. He said that for years he'd believed that keeping the peace with his first family was worth sacrificing certain truths. It was easier to play the role of the regretful father who stayed than to admit something no one had ever dared to say out loud. And then he dropped the bombshell. Alex wasn't his biological son. I froze. My father said that during the early years of his marriage to Elaine, there had been issues, distance, suspicion, and then one day a confrontation after he found some letters tucked away in Elaine's drawer. Love letters, not from him. She had been having an affair. When she got pregnant, she told him the baby was his, and maybe for a while he wanted to believe it. But something had always nagged at him. The timeline didn't line up, the dates didn't make sense, and when Alex was born, something in him just shifted. He said he spent years doubting, wondering, until finally when Alex was a teenager, he secretly got a DNA test, and the result confirmed everything. Alex was not his child. I remember staring at the screen, my hands trembling. I had to rewind that part just to hear it again. But he didn't stop there. My father said he made the decision to raise Alex anyway, that he thought maybe he could overcome the betrayal for the sake of a boy who hadn't asked for any of it. But the years that followed made it harder and harder to justify. Alex became entitled, cruel, arrogant, the very worst reflection of everything my father stood against. Meanwhile, he said, there was me. He admitted he hadn't been the perfect father, that he let guilt and public opinion steer too much of his life, that he had allowed others, especially Elaine and her circle, to dictate how much I could be included in this world. He thought if he kept me at arm's length, he could avoid making waves. That maybe I'd never notice how deep the rejection really ran. But I did notice. And apparently he had too. He said he began watching from afar. My work ethic, my independence, the way I didn't rely on his name for anything. I had built something from scratch. I never asked for a dime, even when I was struggling. I never came knocking, even when his other child was out there burning his money and legacy. He said that in his final years, he realized something painful. The only real child he had, the only one who loved him without an agenda, was me. And that's why he left everything to me. He said, and I quote, "Not because I owe her, but because I trust her. Because she is mine in every way that matters." By the time the video ended, I was crying. Not from sadness, from a strange kind of grief mixed with validation. For years, I told myself I didn't care, that I didn't need to be accepted by people who didn't see me. But hearing him finally say it out loud, that he saw me, that he knew what had been done to me, cracked something open inside me I hadn't even realized was still there. I called Mr. Bernstein the next day, told him everything. He sat in stunned silence for a while before saying that while the will was already final and secure, the recording explained a lot. He asked what I wanted to do with it. I had to think about that. Part of me wanted to go public, rub it in the faces of everyone who had called me names, painted me as the side product of some scandal, while treating Alex like royalty. But another part of me, maybe the wiser part, knew that some truths didn't need to be shouted. They just need to exist. So I released a short public statement through Mr. Bernstein's office. It didn't mention the recording or Alex's paternity. All it said was that my father made thoughtful, conscious decisions in his final months, rooted in truth and legacy, not obligation or guilt. Privately, I sent the recording to Elaine. She tried calling me multiple times after that. I didn't answer. Her last message was long and desperate, filled with self-pity and regret. She said she never meant to hurt anyone, that she did what she thought was necessary to keep the family together, that she loved Alex and feared what would happen if the truth ever came out. She begged me not to release the recording publicly. I saved the message. I may not use it now, but I will. Some truths are powerful enough without an audience, and some truths are earth-shattering when used at the right time. As for Alex, I heard through quiet channels that he was living somewhere in Switzerland, trying to liquidate the rest of his personal assets. Apparently, even the people who once championed him were now pretending they barely knew him. Funny how fast loyalty disappears when the inheritance does too. So I was waiting for him to lose everything. Only then would I tell him the truth, and then I would sue him and his mother. I will not let it go. I want to see them in a state that I was in when I lost my mother. Meanwhile, I stayed focused. I poured everything into building a foundation in my mother's name to support underprivileged youth. The first scholarship we funded went to a young woman who reminded me of myself at 19, quiet, overlooked, but hungry to prove she was more than people expected. And when I attended the first fundraiser gala, someone asked me a question I hadn't prepared for. They said, "How does it feel knowing your father chose you in the end?" I thought about it. About the girl who used to wait by the door for letters that never came. About the whispered insults from people who saw me as illegitimate. About the years I told myself I was fine with being invisible. And then I said simply, it feels like I was never invisible. I just hadn't been seen by the right person yet. Stay tuned for more stories from our girl relationships.